Okay, so we're going to today talk a little bit about Bitcoin and what I think it can do. Jimmy's given you a few things. Not many people know about what we've been doing or know what Bitcoin can do. And I'll say that quite simply. Practically no one. We're going to give you a little intro into things that are going to come in the next year. Who here thinks you can sign data randomly and have that used in a script? Yes, no. If I run a game or something like that where I have two different basketball teams, I can sign what each one won, and then someone else who I've never met can have that used in a script through digital signing. And I'm going to tell you, we don't need to actually change Bitcoin to do that right now. Small, fast script primitives that we can do that securely. That's now. So these are some of the things we're going to start talking about that can be done. So it's a cryptocurrency, but it's more. What we want to start getting people to understand is that we don't have the same economy with Bitcoin. In the past, everyone has the idea that we've built over the last 10,000 years of a credit-based economy. With Bitcoin, we're going to start teaching you of an equity-based economy. One where instead of owning something that someone else really owns, like credit cards or whatever else, one where you split your house into 1,000 shares or 1,000,000 shares, and you raise money by owning equity in your own home. Think of it this way. There's no more housing crisis. If you own 10,000 shares out of 100,000 in your home now, and there's a massive downturn in the economy, and the price goes down 20%, most people in America would be out of their home right now. If you have an equity-based system, that means you still actually own the same number of shares. If you have a smart contract dictating the amount of rent you pay, how much you can buy, how much you pay back, what you need to do to maintain it, to keep it, then you have an incentive economically and game theoretically to actually start improving your home. You have a reason to care. And when everything goes down, you still own everything. And here's the beauty of it. If there is ever a financial collapse or anything like this, you can buy up more of your home for cheaper. So that's something a little bit different than people haven't thought. It's also compatible with every type of finance on earth, even Islamic and some of the extreme Buddhist ones and whatever else, because it's not debt. So you can start rethinking how we do finance with Bitcoin. So we're going to talk about how this can happen. And we're going to talk about how much more the network can do, because everyone sees little scripts and they complain how little it can do. When I worked for the Australian Stock Exchange back in 1996, we built a broker network called NIPA. We were able to send to many, many brokers all over the country, and we did it at a higher transaction rate than Bitcoin does now. I know people sit there and say what you can and can't do over Bitcoin. I helped build and run a network that operated 5,000 times the capacity in '96. And this idea that everyone needs to run their own, no, they don't. And we're going to explain why. In the next few years, everything's going to be more secure, more transparent than anyone ever believed. One of the things that we're just completing at the moment that I've spent years working on is a totally, basically thresholded blinded signatures. So we can actually have a Bitcoin transaction right now, and you, the exchange, have no idea how much money I hold. You can match different parties, and you don't know how much you've just matched. And it's safe. And interestingly enough, that means I can go out to 20 different exchanges around the world, and they can each blind sign a transaction. And if one of them wants to decide they won't do anything, I don't care. If the Americans or the Chinese or whatever else want to crack down and say this is illegal, too bad. If someone wants to stop me accessing my funds because I'm from Venezuela, so what? It changes everything. If we then link that to property, and we have real property owned this way, it starts to redefine how we have finance in the world. So we're going to talk about a few things like reliance on trust. We need trust in society, but it's misplaced. The idea we have at the moment is we want to trust a system, we want to trust an institution, we want to trust whatever else, and we don't want to think or do or learn. That's what we need to start changing. People need to start understanding and having access to knowledge, and it needs to be transparent so they can see what is actually there. We need real access to nodes. We need to be able to do things on those that actually matters over time, that allows us to calculate the value of transactions, not because we think it's worth something, but because a market, a liquid market, is there. And if we actually start breaking up everything into small tradable components, that's when we start getting liquidity. Because, for instance, rather than buying insurance, if I have a home and I own 50% of it already, why don't I buy, instead of insurance, other properties? If I live in Florida at the moment, I've probably got some problems, or other areas. But what if I have part of my home in Florida and part of a property in New York that pays me rent, and part of a property in Vancouver, and part of one in Sydney, Australia, and one in Paris? If the market goes down, I'm diversified. If an accident happens, I'm diversified. And then I'm also liquid. Because once we start getting into global markets, ones that just happen and can be traded easily, then we start getting a complete different way of doing everything. So, let's see. What do we got? We have, in the time I've been speaking here, way more than a minute. We've had, in just the last minute at the moment, there's 250 million emails sent. 71,000 hours of music listened to on Pandora alone, let alone Spotify and Last.fm and everything else. 80 million photo views. There are probably 70 million of those are funny cat photos on Facebook. Tweets, Google searches, etc. And we're sitting here talking about 1 megabyte limits on blocks. That's what we're doing at the moment. So let's see. Some things. Urbanisation, city as a customer. I'm a terrible, as far, not right or left, but as far in the middle as you can go, libertarian. I think everything should be paid for. That doesn't mean that people don't have charity or don't do whatever else, but at the same time, we can pay for roads, we can pay for access, we can pay for everything. That's what technology allows. It actually means you start getting better quality everywhere people want to use things. We can actually start understanding the cost. Where people go wrong at the moment is they think that will lead to all these big problems. But the real big problem scenario is not where people have to pay for things. It's where they get it for free. Because when you get it for free, there's no accountability. And when you have no accountability, you have politicians and you have councillors and whatever else in government, and you have business people, and like everyone else, it's self-interest, and they react together for their self-interest. And in the proper way of doing things, where we actually have accountability, that works really well. Adam Smith's invisible hand works extremely well, where people know what's actually happening. The old sunshine principle, Judge Leonard Hand. You open up the sunshine and things become honest. And that's what we want to see with the blockchain. We want to see all these things like health. We want to see innovation, everything like that grow. We want people to start looking at different ways of doing things, what technologies we have. And one thing we don't think about is not only Moore's law, which is going to keep going for a long time. The smallest transistor now ever created is 1.5 nanometers. I wrote a paper that's in for publication, and I had to update and pull it back because I put in 3 nanometers. And by the time I had it in peer review, there was already a 1.5 nanometer transistor invented. It'll be a while before that's public. But the reality is, 3 years ago, people said that was impossible. They said quantum tunneling effects mean you cannot have less than 5 nanometers ever, except we do. And that's the whole thing with innovation, with hope. There are always things that we can say won't work, and there are always ways around it. There will be 3D technologies. We will have chips, not that are basically 2D with a little tiny thin layer of extra layers to get extra, but properly 3D. And they will massively scale things. There are some researchers who have posited that Moore's law will end at about 2600, which is probably right, because 2600 is when, at the doubling rate of every 18 months or so, we hit the speed of light. And that's pretty much a fundamental. We won't get faster than that unless we really change physics. And who knows, 500 years, but I won't be around anyway. Storage, digital records. Right now, we have masses of records. They aren't time-stamped, they aren't controlled, they get changed. This is one of the things that happens all the time. Anyone have an idea of what one of the most massive frauds there are out there in most businesses? An example, everyone knows CA, Computer Associates, big public company, global. They settled after a multi-billion-dollar fraud a number of years ago because of backdating customer invoices. That was it. But it led to hundreds of millions of dollars a quarter profitability that they didn't actually have. If you can actually create things that are time-stamped in a way that you can't change, that makes that harder. You have to actually engage in special types of fraud where you collude with the customer, and the customer has one copy and another. You have 2 sets of books. And when you do that over thousands of customers, someone finds out very quickly. So we have smart contracts, everything eventually. One of the things people don't realize is just how powerful Bitcoin can be. Not in just what you see in there with agent-based, but also some of the other areas of the scripting language. It is what is known as a decider. If anyone has read SIPSTA, there's a whole paragraph on what a decider is. It's a total Turing machine is a Turing machine that always halts. And yes, they exist. Turing never said that things had to be infinite. He never once in his life mentioned that. That was actually a 1959 paper by a completely different author talking about a completely different machine. But that's a different issue. The reality is, Turing said unbounded. Unbounded is not infinite. Unbounded just means you can keep adding something and adding something and adding something. And anyone who's studied mathematics will know there's a big difference between being able to have an unbounded system and an infinite system. An unbounded system at maximum reaches an ELIF 0. Anyone who's studied anything to do with Cantor sets or whatever else, ELIF 0 is the simplest of infinities. There are infinities, just to be really difficult. And your simplest one is what you get when you have just counting numbers. So then we have tokens as financial instruments. And many of you here are studying a number of different financial engineering subjects, etc. What happens if we can start adding time? Not just like a CLTV or CSV, but one of the things we'll be releasing soon is the capability of actually embedding and calculating using time within Bitcoin scripts right now. We're not going out there and changing the protocol. We're not going to do anything else. Right now, we can actually embed time and do calculations and have different payments come out because of different times, either block height or actual Unix time, which, if you start thinking about that in external information, derivatives. Anyone know the size of the US derivative market? At the moment, I think it's about 22 trillion US dollars. So it's significant. And I know lots of people complain about it because lots of people lose money, and everyone who loses money complains. The reality is the derivatives market is essential to global trade, like it or not, because you buy wheat because you want breakfast cereals, then how did that get there? The farmer needs money. He can do two things. He can pre-sell his crop and have a guaranteed risk-free return, or he can take a risk, hope that the weather's right, and take a loan. Now, I'd rather have an equity-based system where some guy in Wall Street loses his shirt because he didn't speculate right than a group of farmers lose their shirt. And that's the reality of the scenario. And yes, there are farmers who speculate and lose their shirts, but no one said they had to. If you then play with things you don't understand, that's a different issue. But we can then start looking at all of these derivatives and tokens and asset transfer mechanisms and automate them. We can then take smart contracts and link these. We can have those right now tie into everything from booking a hotel room to leasing a car to unlocking doors to about anything you can start thinking of. There's a very simple way of looking at this. We can automate everything. We are going into a world that is exponentially growing, and eventually it might get to a logarithmic scale where it evens off, but that's beyond anything in my lifetime. So we're going to keep doubling and doubling. And that changes everything. Not just how much power every one of these little devices have, also how many devices you have. If you're old like Jimmy and me, you remember the days when there weren't terribly many microprocessors. There were computers every now and again and things like that. Now, everything is a computer. If you buy a television, it is basically the sort of computer that when I was starting work, I had on my desk in that thing there, probably actually more powerful. Televisions now have Android apps and they have whatever else because they can. Even when you want to use them as a monitor and not have stupid annoying pop-ups, your TV will start doing it now. So we have everything starts to be able to be automated. Now, Jimmy alluded to some of the things we're doing. Other things we're doing is much further than that. Where we said thresholds, we can now take those so that there is a completely dealerless blind system. What that means is no one ever, at any time in history, has to hold your private key. That means a group of us here can each hold a shard. That sharded part of the key can be done in a hierarchical manner so that even if it's mine and I want you to help me protect it, I have a veto. It can be done in such a way that even when we sign transactions, it's a homomorphic scheme where, if you've read Gennaro or any of the others like that, we take something and we do calculations and end up with the result without ever sharing keys. The result of not sharing keys is there is nowhere to lose them. If each of us have something, we're not going to lose a key. There won't be a Mt. Gox, there won't be any of the others that failed. At the same time, it doesn't stop silly people from doing Nigerian scams and sending their money off somewhere, but hopefully if they've got someone they trust co-signing, maybe. It also means that with blinded transactions, I can have a multiple threshold signature on an exchange that doesn't even know how much money I have. So that means it is less likely that anyone's going to even try and break in and steal, because if you don't know how much someone has and there's no way of finding out, it becomes difficult, to say the least. What we have, low trust societies. What do? We're not trying to make a low trust society. Low trust societies don't work well. I've visited a few in the past, some in Asia, some in Africa, other places like this, where people don't trust each other. You get into a scenario where everyone does little bits of things and they control things and it stays within families. And the growth of global commerce, for instance, if you look at the growth during the medieval times, happened because of family relationships. In particular, people look at Hasidic Jews and whatever else in America now, and the diamond trade and why that actually grew up between these family groups. Why? Because they had trust. They trusted their family. If someone didn't do what they wanted, they could drop them out of the group. If at the same time you wanted to go and deal with someone else, other cultures, such as in Venice and things like this, started developing legal frameworks, which ended up in places like England, etc. And those legal frameworks allowed a wider scope of trading. They allowed people to deal with much more over time. And what we need to do is think about how both of those areas work. And the technology we have now allows for an automated response, and contrary to what people think, smart contracts aren't law. I don't care what you do or what you exchange. Any country or state isn't going to disappear overnight, and judges get to say all sorts of things whether you say it was signed or not. Judges can say that contract was not valid. And it doesn't matter that it's a smart contract. If they want to say it's not valid, it's not valid. The end. Move country. Stop dealing with anyone. At the same time, if we start building relationships online, which we're going to start introducing ways of doing, well, identity-based systems. So it doesn't need to be what you think of an identity-based system. It doesn't need to be AML. Each individual can have multiple identities. You can have your Friday night identity, which unfortunately there are probably some...
This is very entertaining on Friday night.
A lot of alcohol, what can we say? There's the way too much alcohol version of yourself that no one wants posted. And there's the professional version of you that you want everyone to think is the only version of you when you're going for a job or anything else. And the reality is we need to be able to have multiple sort of ideas and versions and everything like that going forward. As society changes and we start getting more and more information, we need to be able to start isolating that. So that's something we're also going to have to think about. Borders. Right at the moment, the situation in most countries is that manufacturing has gone down massively. That's what they say, because they look at it in relativistic terms. The reality is, manufacturing in real terms in America is actually about double. The difference is, everything else has grown so much more. So you might have increased manufacturing in the amount you earn from it, but everything else, services and all the rest, have increased more. And that's going to start changing even more. I'm sure, I don't know how many of you remember a few years ago, there used to be protests all the time about Nike. Anyone remember those? Or am I too old? No? Nike had a lot of sweatshops in places like Thailand. Most of those are gone now because Nike invested a whole lot of money in what they call lights out factories. Basically, goods go in, shoes go out, and they don't employ people anymore. So those sweatshops where people earn way less than in the West, but queued up for 9 months to get a job, well, now they hire no one. So that's the world we're going into. We are going to a world where there will be manufacturing, but not as we know it. There will be design, there will be services, there will be implementation. There will not be much building. There might be the Burning Man Festival version of some guy making little things to sell, and someone might make some money out of that. But that's not going to be much. It's going to be very small, very insignificant, and no one cares. There will be some people who pay excessive amounts for their vegetables, like me. But that's only because I can now. When I was young, I came from a very poor family. I know what it's like to eat shit food, and most people in the world do. We were over in Africa just a few weeks ago, and when you see people living there, they don't care whether there's a spot on their tomato or not. They're not as fussy as I am these days. So we're going to have a world without borders, not because we think we need these handmade things or whatever else, but because with 3D printing, with everything else coming, it's going to change drastically. There are now printed cars. There are printers coming for everything. They're expensive, but I see printers now as laser printers in the 80s. And they will get cheaper and faster and bigger. HP have one that will print 2 meters by 2 meters, which is enough for a table. If you particularly wanted that, you could. That's what we're heading for. That will give us bespoke design, and it will change many things. And people will start thinking about differentiating, not because if they can have a little bit more, they can print a slightly different table or a slightly different chair or whatever they want. Different clothing. There are clothing printers now, and they will change the garment factory. There are metal printers that actually print even machine parts. There's one in the States that is now printing aircraft parts. They're that higher quality. There is a company in China that has been patenting a concrete printer that prints houses and can print 4 houses a day. Seriously. Large houses, whatever else, not just ugly round ones like they started, but completely automated printing houses. So that's what we're getting to. Now, what we have to start thinking about is how we're going to design all this. And we have contracts as games. How do we ensure that things work properly? Then we're not looking at necessarily the same way that Jimmy would have written contracts in the past as a lawyer, in the hard, convoluted, no one can understand manner that has been legal services forever. We need to think, how do we do something that actually gets the results everyone wants? As Jimmy will say, win-win. And that's what we're aiming for. We want things that work. Because one of the things we can start building into all this is reputation. And reputation will matter. Not because of you as an individual, but you as your business identity, you as a company. Market and brand, for instance, is all about, well, basically identity. You make a product that people think is better. That's identity. This is what we're going to have to start thinking about how we build into contracts. Now, game, what sort of places do we have to move? How can we do it? Chess, it's a very simple game. And there are more moves in chess than there are atoms in the universe. So, as complex as it seems, it is simple. We have other games, and reality is, when we get to more complex games to start thinking about, even something like poker is incredibly complex. That's why we don't model it yet. So, what do? The world is not pure electronic. How do we establish titles over different things? We have things like tractors. If some guy in the middle of Uzbekistan wants to plant a crop in his field, which hopefully the Americans don't do anything and it becomes poppies, and how do we get title over that tractor? In the Americas, the whole idea of titles has been changing on these things, and a lot of complaint because John Deere have been locking their things with smart contracts and everything like that on their tractors already. And they can do it because if you look at some of the more complex equipment, it will actually self-drive. So farmers will buy 20 tractors and they will rent out what they do on pieces of land. And the tractor uses GPS signals from GlobalSat to basically within a centimetre of each tractor go forth and do what they need to do, harvest, etc. More accurately than any father could drive. So one guy gets to program and all the rest, and that's how it's going to change. And that happens because of efficiency. So our little guy over there in Uzbekistan can't afford this yet, but think about where we are now. Think about the growth that we're having in computational power. And I alluded to this a little bit before with Moore's Law. And then I said how we have more devices coming. That's the other bit we're not thinking about. Everything is being chipped. Everything has extra power in it now. Everything has computational capability. There are sunglasses now with cameras because they can. There are smartwatches everywhere. There's about everything you can think of has a camera. When I was young, digital cameras, I had one of the first ones actually, one by Logitech. Big, ugly thing that did 300 by 200 grayscale pictures with 16 different shades of grey. And it cost a few $1,000s and it was total shit. And I can't even access it anymore because, well, they needed special ISA cards and I'd have to actually build a really old computer to keep it going. So it's just not even worth it. Everything is changing and being redone in ways we can't even believe will happen. So things should be made as simple as possible and no more. Lots of people say we should make things really simple. Others say we make them more complex. We're aiming for a balance in everything. That's what all of this matters about. Not how decentralized, not how centralized, not anything else. What works best? What is economically most efficient? What helps the most people? And this is the funny thing with economics that people don't like. I know it's the dismal science and all this stuff, but the reality of economics is it allows us to actually see the point where we get optimality. That's not going to ever be the point where people want. Economics doesn't give us utopia because utopia doesn't exist. It will never exist. The problem with utopia is your utopia is not his utopia, is not your utopia, is not your utopia. No one person will ever have the same utopia as another. I get on very well with my wife, and our utopias would be completely, radically different. Even anyone who's in any relationship will very quickly learn that you have to compromise. And if you have to compromise when there's only a pair of people, welcome to society. Welcome to this little end to the bang type situation where how many of us want to interact, and permutation theory tells us basically when there's more than a few of us, forget it. So, automation, job disruption. As I said, we have to start thinking of new ways to do things. We have to start, in effect, rewiring the world. Education is going to change. Sales is going to change. Manufacturing is going to change. I had the displeasure of getting kicked out of the room by my wife when she was talking about a relative who wanted to get into the transport industry and would probably be finishing school and everything in 5 years. And my comment would have been, screw that, that's really stupid, and hence getting kicked out. The answer there is, think about it for a minute. We have Ford and Volvo, we have Google, we have ... all developing automated solutions. We won't have truck drivers in 10 years' time because it's not whether the vehicle is perfect, it's whether it is better than people. All these things are going to change. All these roles are going to change. So we have to start thinking again. And this isn't the first time it happened. The world changed when we got automobiles. The world changed when we had trains. The world changed when we had the printing press. One thing about history is it's a constant change. So, why the third world? Third world's a good place to start thinking about too. Not because they can be milked, like everyone says, because the reality of the scenario is no one milks the third world. The problem with the third world and economics in the third world is no one has economics with the third world. The total amount of commerce to the third world from all the Western world is like 3% of the global GDP. They just don't create anything. And that's what we can start changing in a digital economy. If you start thinking, educated people, how do you educate people first of all? We get cheaper and cheaper access to the internet. We get cheaper digital devices. We get access to be able to get any information. Also a lot of bad information, but we get more and more out there. More and more connectivity, more and more opportunities to learn. Unfortunately, more and more opportunities to watch the Kardashians and waste our time, but also more opportunities to access things that matter. That allows people to start having opportunities. We can't force anyone to take an opportunity, but they're going to be there. Bitcoin and the blockchain then opens up means and opportunities for these people to start really earning and creating. If you start thinking about intellectual property for these people, we mentioned DRM. If they design a better chair, a better table, a better widget, a better whatever else, they should be able to benefit from that. And if some guy in Ghana can basically create something that people in the West want and sell it, good. Right at the moment, there are several problems. Number one, access to education. Number two, bribery, corruption. Number three, lack of controls and saving. All of these and many more can start being solved. They're the sort of things we can do. We can actually change the world in a positive manner and not be ashamed of the fact that we're actually making money doing it. So I know that's a terrible thing for many people to hear, but be proud of the fact that you make money as you help people. It's a good thing. Don't ever be sort of, oh no, I made money. All right, merchants. So, first thing, we need to make things easier. Right at the moment, the main big difficulty, not in smart contracts, not on any of the fun stuff I'm doing behind the scenes, biggest problem with Bitcoin and every other thing out there like this, it's hard. It works when my grandmother, who's just about 97, can use it. And she doesn't really like computers. Her idea of a computer is a calculator from Texas Instruments in the 70s, and that's about as far as she'll go. When she can go up there and buy something and be securely using her Bitcoin without losing things, then it works. When someone in a third world country can then receive goods and services with Bitcoin, it works. When we can send things globally and internationally, easily, and allow it to happen, and go up to any store and just pay, it works. And like it or not, we don't have good UIs. I mean, I can't design a UI for the, to save myself. User interfaces aren't my thing. I'm not going to try. I put up one the other day and someone said, oh, that's so ugly. And I went, thank you. So, let's see, Bitcoin. We have this interconnected network here that we're going to basically want to take further. It's not quite what people think. Some of the things why we're here is, and this is where I get to sort of float around and ask you questions, and you guys also ask me questions and all the rest. We want to start taking some of the data we have, some of the access to things we have, some of the patents we have, some of the other things, and we want people to build them. Now, my business plan is one that I got told back when I was in Australia is not a real business plan. You're not an enterprise, go away. Which was basically, we own Bitcoin. We make things that make Bitcoin worth more. Profit. Very simple. So I know it's like the underwear gnomes and whatever else, and get underwear, something, profit, and that's our bet. We're trying to help everyone else do the something. So, you guys, what you're here for and what we're here for together, we want to start dealing with people like yourselves to give papers to and have you make proof of concepts to not only pass your course, but hopefully build something. Not us own you necessarily, not the uni own you or anything like that. Build something. A paper that gets you famous. A business idea that you get seed funded, which, go annoy Jimmy because he does that shit. I just make him spend stuff. That's what we're here for. We want people to think about how you can really change everything. How do we make a simple interface that works? Not trying to change everything at once. How do you want a merchant in a coffee store to actually use Bitcoin? Why do you want this contract to go through? How do you get a particular type of DRM? Now, we've been building a lot of building blocks. Now, some of those are going to be starting soon. We have, that's why we went proof of concepts and what we, everything else. We're building our own, we've got development teams, but I think we have, well, by the end of the year, we'll be close to 200 patents with my ones, so we're getting up there. And out of each of those, there's probably 5 or 6 ideas. I don't care. The reality is, even if we build our team larger, it'll probably be 29 something before we were to build it ourselves. And no, contrary to what you've heard, we're not going to be patent trolls. So we want to actually start getting people involved. So that's why we're talking with Cyril and things. We want to actually have people build ideas. Think about things you can do, especially if they're practical. I'm one of these evil people who prefer practical applied solutions much more than actually theory. So let's open it up a little bit.